I knew the axe was coming. The second Bradley Cross leaned on my cubicle wall like he owned the very oxygen in the room. He was the newly appointed vice president of Apex Enterprise Partners, wearing a slick tailored suit that was far too white for someone who had never missed a corporate bonus or worked a weekend shift. He looked down at me with a patronizing smirk that made my stomach turn instantly. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am 55 years old, and being called sweetheart by a man barely out of his 30s was the first red flag. Your little handshake diplomacy thing is cute, Edward, but we are moving the company into a more scalable, automated model. That was the corporate translation for you are fired, but I will say it with a grin, so you might actually think it is a compliment." 10 minutes later, I found myself sitting in a glass fishbowl of a conference room with our head of human resources, Clara Finch. She slid a thick severance information packet across the table like a cheap birthday card, refusing to meet my eyes as she did. My security badge was deactivated before I had even finished signing the official exit forms. To add insult to injury, they handed me a branded polyester tote bag with the Apex Enterprise Partners logo front and center, as if some cheap corporate swag could cover up the fact that they had just gutted 42 enterprise accounts with a single lazy pen stroke. As I walked past my desk for the very last time, carrying my small box of personal belongings, I let my fingers brush against the worn spine of my dog-eared lighthouse binder. That binder had been my constant companion through 2 major recessions, a global pandemic, and more red-eye flights across the country than I could count on my fingers. Inside those pages were 22 years of proprietary relationship maps, renewal scripts, and the kind of deep client trust that you simply cannot log into a database like Salesforce. It was the exact same binder that Bradley Cross had just dismissed as completely replaceable. What the new vice president did not realize in his buzzword blender brain was that 4 of those accounts, the absolute whales of our portfolio, had very specific key person riders written directly into their active contracts. My name, Edward Vance, was spelled out in black and white text. No Edward Vance, no contract. Bradley had not even bothered to blink when he signed my termination papers. He honestly believed that automated email sequences and generic monthly webinars could replace a 6 o'clock in the morning coffee meeting with a multi-million-dollar client whose children's science fair projects I had sponsored. On my computer monitor, just before it went black, was a faded yellow sticky note that had been stuck there for years. It read, "Check Section 15D. I had written that note during a late-night contract review years ago, after a different greedy executive had tried to cut me out of a major deal I had closed. That specific clause was my quiet insurance policy, one that I had fought tooth and nail for in a stuffy conference room that nobody else remembered now. I smiled when I looked at it, because I knew the next few weeks were going to be very interesting. To understand the weight of that clause, you have to understand the history of this firm. When I first joined Apex Enterprise Partners 22 years ago, we operated out of a cramped suite with only 6 employees. We did not have automated platforms or automated customer relationship tools. We built our reputation on trust, hard work, and direct human communication. Over more than 2 decades, I personally secured our largest accounts, turning small regional businesses into national giants. I spent my weekends traveling to client sites, attending their weddings, and helping them navigate supply chain disasters when other providers walked away. The founders of our firm understood that value, but the founders had recently retired, selling their stakes to a private equity firm that appointed executives like Bradley Cross. To Bradley, employees were not assets. They were expenses to be minimized on a spreadsheet. He saw my salary, my commission structure, and my insistence on personalized client management as legacy issues that needed to be cleaned up. He wanted a clean, digitized operation where clients were managed by automated emails and low-cost customer service representatives in distant time zones. He believed he could pocket the savings and claim a massive bonus for operational efficiency. They think that my silence means surrender, but in reality, my silence means I am counting. I am counting the days until their renewal dates hit. I am counting how long it will take for the first formal termination notices to arrive in their legal inbox. I am counting every single operational mistake they will make now that they have handed my accounts over to a junior coordinator whose idea of relationship management is sending a mass email with bad formatting. I did not beg for my job. I did not argue with Clara Finch, and I did not even look back at Bradley Cross as he stood by the water cooler. He is the kind of man who believes that winning means hearing himself talk louder than everyone else in the room. My win would be much quieter, measured in paper cuts and perfectly timed legal maneuvers, until he is standing in a boardroom wondering why the air feels so thin. I walked out of the glass building, my dress shoes clicking on the polished marble tile, the cheap tote bag swinging at my side. The security guard at the front desk gave me that half-sympathetic nod, reserved for people who have dedicated their lives to a company only to be thrown out like yesterday's trash. But in my head, I was already planning my next moves. I was going to dust off my lighthouse license agreements and review the last 3 years of revenue numbers for those 4 whales. I would make sure every single confidential file was backed up where it belonged, on my side of the fence. The people who call you replaceable never actually bothered to read the fine print. And Section 15D was not just fine print. It was a loaded weapon with a hair trigger, and they had just handed me the keys. By the time the polyester tote bag hit the passenger seat of my sedan, I knew exactly how Apex Enterprise Partners would handle the transition of my key accounts. Sure enough, 2 days later, word got back to me from a former colleague who was still on the payroll. Bradley Cross had rolled out his grand client retention plan, a single automated webinar and a string of mass emails written like dry corporate press releases. There were no personal phone calls, no inquiries about the clients' families, and no handwritten thank you notes. Just glossy PDF attachments and the hollow confidence of an executive who believed that customer engagement was measured solely in email click-through rates. The clients were not amused. They were used to personal attention, and these generic updates made them feel neglected. Bradley's emails were filled with generic graphs showing imaginary user engagement statistics that none of my clients had ever valued. They were used to speaking directly with a decision-maker who could authorize changes on the fly, not an automated system that required them to submit support tickets for every minor issue. Omnicorp Logistics was the very first whale to blink. By blink, I mean their director of procurement sent a beautifully polite nuclear-grade email directly to the contract management inbox. The email stated that pursuant to Section 14.2 of their service agreement, due to the key person change, they were exercising their right to terminate the contract for convenience, effective immediately. That is the kind of sentence that, when you have been in the corporate game long enough, you can hear being read in a stern lawyer's voice. It was less of a polite goodbye and more of a formal obituary for Bradley Cross's career longevity at the firm. When I read the screenshot my friend sent me, I laughed aloud in my kitchen. It was the dark humor of watching someone burn down an entire barn just to swat a single fly. That single account alone was worth more in annual revenue than the entire marketing department's combined salaries. I had spent 11 years building that relationship brick by brick. I had flown out for last-minute dinners when their executive vice president's family member fell ill, and I had sat through hours of boring industry conferences just to close a gap during a difficult renewal. Now, all of that was gone in the time it took them to click the send button on an email. To celebrate, I baked a fresh peach bourbon pie using my grandmother's old recipe. When it came out of the oven, I wrote the word cost of doing business in whipped cream across the top and took a photograph. I almost mailed the picture to Bradley's office, but I decided the joke was better enjoyed in the comfort of my own home, tasting the sweet and smoky flavors. The part that would make the leadership team at Apex choke if they realized it was that those key person riders were not some standard template the company had designed. I had negotiated every single one of them myself, sometimes dragging our legal department into phone calls they absolutely hated, and sometimes waiting out the client's procurement teams until they finally caved to my demands. Key person clauses are rare in enterprise contracts for a reason. Corporations absolutely hate being handcuffed to an individual human being. But my whales had insisted on them because they knew that what they were buying was not just a software service. They were buying my expertise, my responsiveness, and my dedication to their operational success. In the old days, I kept the key renewal dates scribbled on a physical wall calendar in my cubicle, circled in a thick red marker. It was part talisman and part scoreboard. That calendar was now hanging in my home office, and I could see exactly what was about to happen next. Summit Financial had their renewal notice due in 12 days. Beacon Health Group was 18 days away, and Zenith Retail was 24 days away. I did not even need to make a single phone call to them. The clock was ticking all on its own, and the silence from my end was deafening. I could picture Bradley Cross sitting in his corner office, spinning his expensive leather chair toward the window while explaining to the chief executive officer that some client churn is completely normal during leadership transitions. That is what amateurs call losing a customer they thought was captive. Professionals like me call it a slow, fatal bleed, and this was only the first drop of blood. That night, I opened my personal archive files and read through the key person agreements once more. They were clean, tight, and completely airtight. I had drafted them specifically to survive bad leadership. The whales did not need me to reach out to them. They already knew the drill. My sudden departure was not a minor hiccup in their operations. It was a tripwire that they were legally prepared to pull. 3 days later, my personal cell phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. When I answered, I heard a familiar, warm voice that was loaded with corporate subtext. It was the director of relations from Summit Financial. They were politely fishing to see if I was available and where my next destination would be. I smiled into the receiver, keeping my answers vague but reassuring. The bleed had begun, and there is nothing corporate management hates more than realizing a wound will not clot. They would soon discover that without me, their entire portfolio of top-tier accounts was nothing more than sand slipping through their fingers. It did not take long for the quiet tension at the Apex office to turn into a full-blown storm. 12 days after Omnicorp Logistics walked away, Summit Financial sent their own formal termination notice. There was no emotion, no flowery language, and no excuses. They simply cited Section 11.B of their agreement, stating they were terminating the contract immediately due to the key person change. They did not even bother to ask about the transition plan because they already knew a competent one did not exist. That account had been my personal project since the ink dried on their very first contract. I had once convinced their chief financial officer to renew during a severe economic downturn by sending him a specialized care package and the exact brand of imported coffee he preferred. Now, that multi-million-dollar relationship vanished into the legal ether with a single click of a computer mouse. Summit Financial's operations relied heavily on our daily manual balance verifications, a task I had managed personally to ensure zero errors. When they realized a junior representative was instead handling their accounts, their chief operating officer called me privately, expressing deep concern that their financial data was being handled with such negligence. He told me that their board of directors would not tolerate such risks, especially with their annual audit approaching rapidly in the coming months. Zenith Retail's leadership also grew tired of receiving canned responses to their system integration issues, which began to cause significant delays in their supply chain management during their peak sales season. Beacon Health Group did not even wait for their scheduled renewal date. 18 days after my termination, their formal notice landed in the legal department's inbox. The timestamp was so close to lunch that I could picture the young paralegal reading it over a sandwich. Same reason cited, same signature block. Another 7-figure account was completely gone, and all Bradley Cross had to show for his grand strategy was a webinar recording that absolutely nobody had watched past the 4th slide. Inside the Apex offices, it was absolute chaos. My friend in operations described the atmosphere as watching a kitchen catch fire while the head chef stands in the middle of the smoke, insisting that the smell is just fine. The executive leadership ordered a rapid response plan, which was really just code for endless emergency meetings where managers argued about marketing copy instead of fixing the actual problem. The clients were not buying the company's brand name. They were buying my relationship management. To make matters worse for the panicked leadership, Zenith Retail sent their termination letter 24 days after my departure, completing the total collapse of my former portfolio. In less than a month, Apex Enterprise Partners had lost $45 million in annual recurring revenue. The executive team was in a state of absolute terror, knowing that the board of directors would demand immediate answers for this unprecedented disaster. The spreadsheet projections Bradley Cross had used to justify my termination were now completely worthless. The company was facing a financial crisis, and their attempts to assign my former duties to junior staff members had resulted in a series of embarrassing mistakes that only further alienated the remaining clients. That was when the real comedy began. The chief executive officer's executive assistant, a woman who had never once spoken to me in my 22 years at the firm, sent me a terse email with the subject line, "Urgent request for sales scripts and client maps." There was no greeting and no polite pleasantries. She simply demanded that I immediately hand over the documents from my lighthouse binder. They had absolutely no clue that those scripts and relationship maps were not company property. Every single year, without fail, I had licensed the Lighthouse framework to the company for a 12-month period at a negotiated rate. That rate was tucked away in a special services addendum in my contract, signed off by a former general counsel who actually knew how to read contracts. The very day they walked me out of the building was the day that license officially expired. I did not respond to the email. Instead, I pulled out my physical copies of the signed agreements, my work logs, and the email chains going back a decade. Each agreement was clearly marked as employee-originated methodology, licensed and not assigned. My annual performance reviews backed this up, stating that my proprietary relationship framework had resulted in massive retention rates. They had even called it proprietary in writing, foolishly assuming that proprietary meant it belonged to the company. I spread the paperwork across my dining room table like a general planning a major battle. This was not revenge yet. It was simple self-preservation. You do not strike back until you have cataloged every single receipt, every signature, and every timestamp. Then my phone lit up with the caller ID showing the main office number. I let it ring for a few seconds before answering. Returned to the office immediately, the chief executive officer's voice barked before I could even say hello. "We will file a lawsuit to compel performance if you do not comply." His voice was gravelly and tight with stress. I let him talk, letting him believe he was still in control of the situation. I did not correct him, and I did not mention that Section 15D was sitting highlighted on my table like a bear trap. Instead, I calmly suggested we read the contract together in a formal meeting. I could hear his jaw tighten. The silence that followed was the sound of a man stepping onto thin ice, completely unaware that it was already cracking beneath his feet. The email invitation arrived in my inbox later that afternoon, titled Emergency Strategy Session with a mandatory attendance tag. I accepted the meeting block without adding any comments, replying only with a single short sentence. "Please confirm that General Counsel will be present in the room." There was no way I was going to step back into their executive boardroom without a legal witness whose job it was to read and interpret the exact contract language I was about to present to them. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed with deliberate care. I wore a neutral silk button-down shirt and a tailored navy blazer, choosing to wear no jewelry other than my simple watch. I carried a slim leather folio containing 3 clean copies of my employment agreement and a separate red folder marked in bold black ink, "Lighthouse Licensing Agreements Complete." The leather folio was for general discussion, but the red folder was the actual ammunition. I drove to the office in the early morning fog, watching the city wake up. When I arrived, the lobby security guard had to issue me a temporary visitor pass because my employee credentials had been completely deleted from the database. It was a strange feeling, walking through the glass doors as a guest after 22 years of service. I rode the elevator in silence with several junior analysts who kept their eyes glued to their phones, completely unaware of the corporate storm that was about to unfold on the top floor. As I waited in the reception area, the quiet hum of the office felt completely different. The walls were decorated with posters talking about collaboration and innovation, but the faces of the employees walking past looked exhausted and tense. The company's stock price had taken a visible hit in the financial news that morning, and the nervous energy in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. When I walked into the boardroom, the air conditioning was running so cold that the room felt like a freezer. It was the typical temperature for executive rooms, where leaders made terrible decisions they fully intended to blame on someone else. The chief executive officer, Richard Caldwell, was already seated at the head of the table, his tie slightly crooked and a cheap paper cup of coffee in his hand. The vice president, Bradley Cross, was leaning back in his chair with a smug expression that suggested he thought this meeting was a mere formality and that I was about to fall in line. The head of human resources, Clara Finch, sat off to the side, nervously shuffling a stack of papers she did not need to touch. Every few minutes, Clara would clear her throat. A habit I had long ago learned meant she knew the company was in trouble, but was too afraid to say it out loud. Richard opened the meeting with pure bluster, raising his voice as if he were addressing a stadium instead of a small room. He threw around heavy legal terms like breach of contract, operational obligation, and critical business necessity. Bradley nodded along eagerly, believing his presence added weight to the threats. When the chief executive officer finally paused to take a breath, I opened my leather folio slowly and slid 3 copies of my employment contract across the table. One for Richard, one for Clara, and one for the general counsel, Harvey Miller. "Let us look at the contract together," I said. Keeping my voice entirely neutral, I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 bright yellow sticky flags, placing one on Section 15D and the other on Exhibit G, the section labeled Employee-Originated Accounts. I did not explain what the clauses meant. I did not need to do so. I wanted their own legal counsel's eyes to go exactly where the trap was laid. Harvey Miller adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to read the document. At first, his eyes moved quickly, skimming the pages with the bored confidence of a lawyer who assumed he knew what was written. But then, the pen he had been tapping on the table stopped. His lips began to move silently as he read the same sentence a second time, as if he were trying to make sure he was not experiencing a hallucination. He turned the page to Exhibit G, then looked back at Section 15D, and finally looked up at me with an expression that had completely lost its neutrality. Bradley's smirk faltered, his posture stiffening slightly. Clara stopped shuffling her papers entirely. "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands," I said, keeping my voice steady. Section 15D was negotiated specifically to protect my interests after prior management attempted to reassign my accounts without my consent. It outlines the exact financial consequences if the company terminates my employment without cause and then attempts to compel my services. I tapped my finger on the table. Exhibit G lists the 4 major accounts defined as employee-originated. Those are the exact 4 accounts that have terminated their relationships with Apex over the last 2 weeks. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper as if the words could somehow change if he looked at them from a distance. The general counsel kept reading, much slower now, and I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. It is the silent panic that strikes a corporate lawyer when he realizes his own client has walked straight into a multi-million-dollar disaster. I did not interrupt the silence. The storm was much more powerful when it was allowed to gather its own force. General Counsel Harvey Miller finally laid his pen down, placing his palm flat over Section 15D, as if he were trying to physically hold the words to the page. His voice was low and deliberate as he read the clause aloud to the silent room. "Upon termination without cause, first, all non-compete and non-solicitation covenants dissolve immediately with respect to employee-originated accounts. Second, any attempt by the company to compel the employee's services post-termination triggers a mandatory buyout payment equal to 3.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue from those accounts. Third, any continued use of Lighthouse materials post-termination without an active license constitutes willful intellectual property infringement with mandatory fee shifting." Harvey stopped reading, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The silence in the room was absolute. I could see the math running through his mind. Bradley Cross, still trying to project authority, let out a nervous laugh and muttered that the language was overly generous and would never hold up in a court of law. Harvey did not even look at the vice president. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward Clara Finch. "Did we terminate Edward without cause?" he asked, his voice quiet. Clara did not answer immediately. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looked at the chief executive officer, and then looked down at her hands. That silence was the only answer we needed. It was the pause of an HR director who knew the paper trail would condemn them. Richard Caldwell cleared his throat, trying to break the tension, but he looked pale. The math was simple and devastating. 4 major accounts with a combined trailing 12-month revenue in the high 7 figures, multiplied by 3.5, plus statutory damages for copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106 and Section 504. It was the kind of number that could destroy a company's quarterly profits and lead to an immediate shareholder revolt. But the situation was about to get worse. I reached into my red folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table. "This is the last signed Lighthouse licensing agreement," I said. "It clearly shows the expiration date, which was the exact day I was terminated. No renewal fee was paid, which means every single day you have used my sales scripts since then constitutes a separate act of willful copyright infringement." To back up my claim, I slid a printout of the server access logs across the table. These are the security logs for the shared directory where my templates are stored. They show multiple logins from your junior sales staff, complete with timestamps, IP addresses, and user identification codes. My voice was quiet and steady. "I have learned that when you speak softly in a room full of panicked executives, they have to lean in to hear you, and when they lean in, they are truly listening." The chief financial officer, who had been called into the room minutes earlier, stared at the logs, his hand shaking slightly as he calculated the potential legal damages. Harvey Miller read through the access logs once, then turned the page face down on the table. Richard Caldwell rubbed his temples, his bluster completely gone. Bradley Cross sat frozen, realizing that his attempt to cut costs had instead triggered a massive financial landmine. I opened my leather folio one last time and placed 2 envelopes on the table, labeled Option A and Option B. I slid them forward side by side. "Option A," I explained, "is that you retain me as an independent consultant at a rate of $1,250 per hour, with a 300-hour minimum paid in advance. In addition, Bradley Cross resigns immediately, the company issues a formal apology for role misclassification, and you reinstate the Lighthouse license at triple the previous annual rate. Option B is that I decline to assist you. I walk across the street to join your primary competitor, Sentinel Solutions, who has already drafted employment offers for me and transition agreements for the 4 whales. And you wire the full contract buyout amount, plus copyright infringement damages to my account by Thursday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon." The room remained silent as the executive stared at the 2 envelopes. Nobody reached for them. They did not need to open them to know that the numbers were non-negotiable. I stood up, closing my leather folio with a quiet click. "You can make your decision now, or you can discuss it with your board," I said politely. "But the clock is running, and Sentinel Solutions is waiting for my call." I walked out of the boardroom, leaving them with their signatures and the heavy weight of their own contracts. On Thursday morning, my bank account received a wire transfer for the full buyout amount and the copyright settlement fees. By Thursday afternoon, I had signed a contract with Sentinel Solutions, and by the following Monday, all 4 of my major clients had officially moved their business to my new firm. Bradley Cross was quietly let go by the board. 2 weeks later, his corporate career effectively ended by the very spreadsheet he had tried to use against me. As I sat in my new corner office looking out at the city skyline, I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. Some people believe that everyone is replaceable, but they always forget to read the fine print.